How's it going, everyone? This is Bill from Great American Classics. Today we're going to talk about something called the Battle of Ong Tan, when the Black Lions marched into sunlight. Now, this is a story that breaks my heart every time I think about it, but it's one that needs to be told. It's about a battalion of American soldiers with one of the proudest histories in the United States Army who walked into an ambush in the jungles of Vietnam and were nearly wiped out in a matter of hours. It's about young men, many of them draftees who never asked to be soldiers, who found themselves in a place called the Long Nguyen Secret Zone on the morning of October 17, 1967. It's about what happens when the pressure to produce results meets the reality of an enemy who is waiting for you. So let's take a look back and try to understand what those men went through and why their story still matters today. To understand what happened that October morning, you first have to understand who the Black Lions were. The 28th Infantry Regiment was one of the most decorated units in the history of the United States Army. They earned their nickname during World War I at a small French village called Cantigny. And the story of that battle tells you a lot about the kind of unit they were. In the spring of 1918, American forces were still largely untested in combat. The United States had entered the war a year earlier, but most American troops had been training with the British and French, learning the hard lessons that European soldiers had paid for in blood since 1914. There was real doubt among the Allied commanders about whether American soldiers could actually fight, whether these fresh-faced boys from Ohio and Texas and New York could stand up to the battle-hardened German army that had nearly won the war twice already. The Battle of Cantigny was supposed to answer that question. On May 28, 1918, the 28th Infantry Regiment led the first major American offensive of the war. They attacked a German salient centered on the village of Cantigny, located in the ancient French province of Picardy. It was not a large operation by the standards of the Western Front, but it mattered enormously for morale and prestige. The 28th Infantry went over the top behind a rolling artillery barrage supported by French tanks and aircraft, and they took the village. Then they held it against 5 determined German counterattacks over the next 3 days, suffering over 1,600 casualties in the process, including nearly 200 killed in action. The French were so impressed that they awarded the regiment the Croix de Guerre with palm, their highest military honor, and the regiment adopted a symbol from the coat of arms of Picardy, a black lion rampant, as their own. From that day forward, they were the Lions of Cantigny, or simply the Black Lions. The regiment fought again in World War II, landing on Utah Beach on July 4, 1944, and pushing through the hedgerows of Normandy, the horrors of the Hurtgen Forest, and the desperate fighting of the Battle of the Bulge. They earned 3 Presidential Unit citations and took over 115,000 prisoners of war. They were one of those units that seemed to attract both glory and tragedy in equal measure. And by the time they deployed to Vietnam in 1965, they carried with them the weight of all that history. The Black Lions who went to Vietnam were part of the 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, for the distinctive red numeral on their shoulder patch. The division had been commanded during World War II by one of the most colorful and controversial generals in American history, a man named Terry de la Mesa Allen. General Allen was a fighter and a maverick, beloved by his men for his aggressive leadership and his willingness to put mission accomplishment ahead of military appearances. He led the Big Red One through North Africa and Sicily before being relieved of command, partly because his superiors felt he was too informal and too close to his troops. He finished the war commanding another division and retired as a major general, a legend in the infantry community. His son, Terry de la Mesa Allen Jr., followed him into the Army, The younger Allen graduated from West Point in 1952, served in Korea, and worked his way up through the officer corps. By 1967, he was a lieutenant colonel, and when he received orders to Vietnam, fate placed him in command of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, the very unit that was part of the same division his father had commanded a quarter-century earlier. It was the kind of coincidence that seemed almost too perfect. A fourth-generation soldier leading a storied battalion that had helped make his father famous. But Vietnam was not World War II, and the lessons of one war do not always apply to the next. The war that Lieutenant Colonel Terry Allen Jr. found in Vietnam was different from anything the American military had experienced before. There were no front lines, no clear objectives to capture and hold. The enemy could be anywhere and everywhere. A village that was friendly one day might be hostile the next. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army had learned over decades of fighting, first against the Japanese, then the French, and now the Americans, how to use the terrain and the population to their advantage. They avoided pitched battles when they could, preferring to harass and ambush, to inflict casualties and fade back into the jungle before American firepower could be brought to bear. And when they did choose to stand and fight, it was usually on ground of their choosing, in circumstances designed to neutralize American advantages in artillery and air support. The American strategy in 1967 was something called search and destroy. The idea was to send units out into the jungle to find the enemy, fix him in place, and destroy him with superior firepower. On paper, it made a certain amount of sense. American forces had overwhelming advantages in mobility, thanks to helicopters, and in firepower, thanks to artillery and aircraft. If you could find the enemy and force him to fight, you could kill him in numbers that his commanders could not afford to replace. The problem was that the enemy understood this strategy as well as the Americans did, and he was very good at not being found, or at being found only when he wanted to be, under circumstances that suited his purposes rather than ours. By the fall of 1967, there was intense pressure from Washington to produce results. President Lyndon Johnson needed to show the American people that the war was being won, that the enormous investment of blood and treasure was paying off. This pressure filtered down through the chain of command, from the White House to the Pentagon to Military Assistance Command Vietnam to the divisions and brigades and battalions in the field. Commanders at every level felt the need to report enemy killed, weapons captured, objectives taken. And because promotion and career advancement depended on performance, there was a tendency to push units harder, to send them out again and again in search of an enemy that always seemed to be somewhere else. The men who bore the burden of this pressure were the soldiers on the ground, the riflemen and machine gunners and grenadiers who humped through the jungle with 50-pound packs in 100-degree heat, always alert for booby traps and ambushes, never sure who was friend and who was foe. Many of them were draftees, young men who had been plucked from their civilian lives and sent to a war they did not fully understand, to fight for objectives that were never clearly explained. The individual replacement system meant that unlike in previous wars, where units trained and deployed together, soldiers arrived in Vietnam as individuals and were plugged into existing units as needed. This made it harder to build the kind of unit cohesion that helps soldiers survive combat, the bonds of trust and familiarity that come from knowing the man beside you, knowing his strengths and weaknesses, knowing that he will be there when you need him. One of those draftees was a 20-year-old kid from Urbana, Ohio, named Mike Troyer. Troyer had been studying psychology at Urbana College during the day and working the night shift at the Navistar truck plant, trying to make a better life for himself. But he had dropped a course, fallen below the minimum credit hours required for a student deferment, and in 1967, his draft notice arrived. Like his father and grandfather before him, Troyer did what he was told. He reported for induction, went through basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky, then jungle warfare training at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and Fort Lewis, Washington. He was assigned to Delta Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, the Black Lions, and shipped out to Vietnam in the summer of 1967. Troyer arrived at Lai Khe, the base camp of the 1st Infantry Division, about 40 miles northwest of Saigon. He was made an acting squad leader, responsible for a handful of other young men who were just as scared and confused as he was. He did not question the war or his place in it. His attitude, as he later described it, was simple. The government owned him, and he would do whatever they told him to do. If they wanted him to fight communists, he would fight communists. If they wanted him to fight flamenco dancers, he would fight flamenco dancers. It was not his job to think about the big picture. His job was to survive for 12 months until his date eligible for return from overseas, and then go home. But Troyer quickly learned that surviving in Vietnam was not simply a matter of following orders and keeping your head down. The frustrations of the war ate at the soldiers in ways that were hard to articulate. The enemy never fought fair. They used booby traps and mines that killed without warning. They fired from concealed positions and vanished before you could shoot back. And the American command structure, with its emphasis on body counts and measurable results, seemed designed to get soldiers killed rather than to win the war. Troyer was particularly galled by the way senior officers managed operations from helicopters overhead, far from the danger, while the men on the ground did the dying. Battalion commanders and brigade commanders would fly over in their command helicopters, issuing orders and demanding action, while the grunts below struggled through terrain that was almost impossibly difficult to move through. And then, after a day of exhausting marching, some general would swoop down and complain that the perimeter was not set up according to regulations, that the foxholes were not dug to the proper depth, that some detail of doctrine had not been followed. The enemy, as Troyer put it, could not read English, so they got all the breaks while the Americans got killed. In the weeks before October 17th, the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry, had been operating as part of something called Operation Shenandoah II, a search and destroy mission aimed at clearing Viet Cong forces from the area around Highway 13 and the Michelin rubber plantation. The battalion had been in the field for over a week, moving through thick jungle terrain west of the town of Chon Tan, looking for the enemy and finding mostly empty camps and abandoned bunkers. On October 16th, the day before the ambush, elements of the battalion had stumbled onto a fortified Viet Cong bunker system south of their night defensive position, near a small stream called the Ong Tan. A firefight broke out, and the Americans took some casualties, but also inflicted damage on the enemy, killing at least 17 Viet Cong. Lieutenant Colonel Allen, pleased with the results, decided to return the next morning with a stronger force to finish the job. What Allen did not know, what he could not have known, was that the bunker system was not some isolated outpost, but part of a major base camp belonging to the 271st Viet Cong Regiment. The 271st was one of the most experienced and effective enemy units in the war, part of the 9th Viet Cong Division that had been operating in this area for years. The regiment had been resting and resupplying, waiting for orders for a new offensive, when the Americans stumbled onto their position. Colonel Vo Min Triet, the regimental commander, faced a decision. He could withdraw and avoid contact which was the usual Viet Cong strategy when facing superior American firepower. Or he could stand and fight on ground that he knew intimately, ground where he had fortified positions and where the dense jungle would negate American advantages in air support and artillery. He chose to fight. On the night of October 16th, the 271st Regiment, reinforced by elements of another unit, positioned itself for a three-sided ambush along the route the Americans would have to take to reach the bunker complex. There were between 1,200 and 1,400 enemy soldiers dug in and waiting, some of them as close as 10 meters from the trail the Americans would be walking down. They had machine guns, rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortars. They had the advantage of surprise and prepared positions, and they had the patience to wait until the moment was exactly right. On the morning of October 17, 1967, Lieutenant Colonel Allen led his battalion out of their night defensive position shortly after 8 a.m. He had 2 companies with him, Alpha Company in the lead and Delta Company bringing up the rear, with the battalion command group in between. Bravo Company stayed behind to guard the base camp. It was a small force, somewhere between 135 and 155 men, walking in a column through dense jungle that limited visibility to a few meters in any direction. The plan was to advance to the bunker complex they had found the day before, clear it of any remaining enemy, and then continue the search and destroy mission. First Lieutenant Clark Welch, the commander of Delta Company, had argued against this plan. Welch was an experienced officer, aggressive and capable, who had a reputation for knowing his business. He had been involved in the skirmish the day before and thought it was foolish to return along the same route, to walk back into an area where the enemy knew they were coming. But his objections were overruled. The pressure to produce results, to keep moving, to find and destroy the enemy, was too strong. And so the Black Lions marched into the jungle that morning, walking single file through the undergrowth, sweating in the tropical heat, each man lost in his own thoughts about home and family and survival. They walked for about 2 hours, covering maybe 1.5 kilometers in the thick terrain. Alpha Company, in the lead, passed unknowingly within meters of concealed enemy positions. The Viet Cong soldiers held their fire, waiting for the right moment, waiting until the entire American force was inside the kill zone. Then someone opened fire, and the jungle exploded. The first shots came from the front and the flanks simultaneously, catching Alpha Company in a deadly crossfire. Machine guns raked the column from multiple directions. Snipers in the trees picked off officers and radio operators, the men whose deaths would cause the most confusion. Rocket-propelled grenades slammed into groups of soldiers. The noise was overwhelming, the chaos absolute. Men went down by the dozen in the first seconds of the fight. Lieutenant Colonel Allen, in the command group between the 2 companies, immediately tried to organize a response. He called for artillery support, tried to get his companies to maneuver against the ambush, tried to do all the things that doctrine said you were supposed to do when caught in an ambush. But doctrine assumed that you had room to maneuver, that you could identify the enemy's positions, that you could bring your superior firepower to bear. In the dense jungle of the Long Nguyen secret zone, none of those assumptions held. The enemy was everywhere, firing from concealed positions that the Americans could not see. The jungle canopy made air support almost impossible, and the Viet Cong had adopted a tactic they called hugging the belt, pressing so close to the American positions that artillery and airstrikes could not be used without killing friendly troops as well. Alpha Company, which had been in the lead, was virtually wiped out in the first 20 minutes. The company commander, Captain Jim George, was killed almost immediately. Squad leaders and platoon sergeants went down one after another. Men who tried to fight back were shot. Men who tried to run were shot. Men who tried to play dead were shot. The Viet Cong moved through the American positions methodically, finishing off the wounded, stripping weapons and equipment from the dead. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. Delta Company, at the rear of the column, had a few seconds more warning than Alpha Company, and First Lieutenant Clark Welch used that time to try to organize a defense. He got his men into something like a perimeter, using anthills and fallen logs for cover, and began directing fire at the enemy positions. But the volume of incoming fire was overwhelming. Men were hit and went down. Ammunition began to run low, and the command group, which was supposed to be coordinating the response, had been shot to pieces. Lieutenant Colonel Allen was wounded multiple times, but kept trying to direct the fight until a burst of machine gun fire killed him. Nearly every member of the battalion command group died with him, including the operations officer, the sergeant major, and several radio operators. With the command structure destroyed, there was no one to call in artillery accurately, no one to coordinate with the helicopters that were trying to help, no one to organize a coherent response to the ambush. For the soldiers still alive, the battle became a matter of individual survival. Mike Troyer, the young draftee from Ohio, found himself crouching behind an anthill, trying to make himself as small as possible while bullets snapped through the air around him. He noticed that whether you lived or died seemed to depend on something as random as whether you were in sunlight or shade. The enemy could see soldiers in the sunlit patches of jungle more easily than those in the shadows. Men who were exposed got shot. Men who found cover in the darkness had a chance. Troyer stayed in the shade and watched his comrades die. He saw men he knew, men he had trained with, cut down by fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The bodies were so shot up that many were unrecognizable. When he later crawled across the battlefield trying to find survivors, he identified one victim only by a tattoo from the 101st Airborne Division on his arm. The face was gone. The fighting lasted for about 2 hours, though it must have felt like an eternity to the men trapped in the kill zone. Eventually, the Viet Cong began to withdraw, melting back into the jungle the way they had come. They took their dead and wounded with them, leaving behind a battlefield littered with American bodies. Reinforcements from the 1st Infantry Division began to arrive by helicopter, but by then, there was nothing to do but collect the dead and evacuate the wounded. The casualty figures from the Battle of Ong Tan were staggering. Of the approximately 142 men who had marched into the jungle that morning, 58 were dead and 75 were wounded. Some accounts put the dead as high as 64. Only a handful walked out without a scratch. Lieutenant Colonel Terry Allen Jr. was among the dead, killed leading his men the way his father had taught him, the way generations of Allens had done before him. Nearly every officer in the 2 companies was killed or wounded. The 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry, the Black Lions of Cantigny, had been virtually destroyed as a fighting force in a single morning. The Viet Cong losses were much lighter, probably somewhere between 20 and 100 killed, though the exact numbers were never confirmed. They had achieved what they set out to do, inflicting a devastating blow on an American battalion and demonstrating that even the best American units could be defeated when they were caught on unfavorable ground. Colonel Vo Minh Triet later said that on that day, no one really won. But that was cold comfort to the families of the 58 American soldiers who came home in body bags. The aftermath of the Battle of Ong Tan was complicated and painful. In the short term, there were questions about how the ambush had happened, why the intelligence had been so poor, why a battalion had been sent into such dangerous terrain without adequate reconnaissance or support. Some blamed Lieutenant Colonel Allen for pressing forward despite the warnings from officers like Clark Welch. Others blamed the higher command for creating a pressure cooker environment where officers felt compelled to take risks to produce results. Still others blamed the Army's whole approach to the war, the reliance on search-and-destroy tactics that seemed designed to walk soldiers into ambushes like the one at Ong Tan. Major General John H. Hay, the commander of the 1st Infantry Division, awarded himself a Silver Star for gallantry in action during the battle, even though he had been in Saigon at the time and was not present on the battlefield. This kind of thing was not unusual in Vietnam, where the medal system had become corrupted by careerism and political pressure. But it struck many veterans of the battle as obscene. The men who had actually been there, who had watched their friends die, received their decorations too, but the meaning was different when you knew what it had cost. First Lieutenant Clark Welch, who had kept Delta Company fighting when everything else had fallen apart, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest decoration for valor. He was seriously wounded in the battle, shot multiple times while trying to organize his men, and was evacuated to a hospital in Japan. His records were lost somewhere in the transfer, and for years he was unable to wear the medal he had earned because the Army had no documentation that he had received it. It took decades and the efforts of fellow veterans to straighten out the bureaucratic mess and give Welch the recognition he deserved. He retired as a lieutenant colonel and spent the rest of his life haunted by what had happened at Ong Tan. In 2002, 35 years after the battle, Welch returned to Vietnam with journalist David Moranis, who was researching a book about the events of October 1967. They met Colonel Vo Minh Triet, the man who had commanded the Viet Cong regiment that had ambushed the Black Lions. The two old soldiers walked the battlefield together, trying to understand what had happened and why. It was an extraordinary moment of reconciliation, or at least acknowledgement, between former enemies. Welch died in 2016, still carrying the weight of that day with him to the end. Mike Troyer survived the battle and finished his tour in Vietnam, returning to Ohio in one piece, at least physically. But he had no illusions that anyone would welcome him home as a hero. Before he left Vietnam, he did something that captures the loneliness and isolation that many veterans felt. He wrote a letter to himself, welcoming himself back to civilian life, and mailed it to his home address. That way, when he arrived back in Ohio, there would be at least one letter waiting for him, one voice saying that someone was glad he had made it. Troyer struggled with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder for the rest of his life. It took him 36 years to get a diagnosis and begin treatment. He eventually wrote a book about his experiences called A Gathering of Warriors, A Forgotten One in Me, trying to make sense of what had happened and to honor the men who had not come home. He earned 3 Bronze Stars, a combat infantry badge, and other decorations for his service. But the medals meant less to him than the memories. He died in January 2019 at the age of 71 and was buried in Ohio with military honors. The Battle of Ong Tan became the subject of 2 important books that tried to tell the full story of what happened that day and what it meant for America. Brigadier General James Shelton, who had been the operations officer for the 2nd Battalion before the battle and was transferred to division headquarters just before October 17th, wrote, "The Beast was out there," a detailed military history that pulled no punches about the mistakes that were made and the lessons that should have been learned. David Moranis, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, wrote, "They marched into sunlight," a broader narrative that connected the battle in Vietnam to the anti-war protests that erupted on the same day at the University of Wisconsin. The book became the basis for a PBS documentary called 2 Days in October, which brought the story to a wider audience. The title of Marinus's book comes from a poem by Bruce Weigel, himself a Vietnam veteran, called Elegy. The image of soldiers marching into sunlight captures something essential about the tragedy of Ong Tan and, in a larger sense, about the tragedy of Vietnam itself. The men who died that day did not march into darkness or into obvious danger. They marched into what looked like an ordinary morning, into a jungle that looked like all the other jungles they had walked through before. They did not know that death was waiting for them just a few meters away, hidden in the trees and the undergrowth, patient and invisible. They marched into sunlight, and the sunlight killed them. The Black Lions recovered from the Battle of Ong Tan, as military units do. New replacements arrived, new officers took command, and the battalion continued to fight for another 2.5 years until the regiment was withdrawn from Vietnam in early 1970. They distinguished themselves in other battles, including the desperate fighting at Fire Support Base Julie in October 1968, where they repelled a suicide attack by an estimated 4 North Vietnamese battalions. The 28th Infantry Regiment still exists today, still carries the Black Lion on its coat of arms, still honors the memory of Can Tin Nhi and all the battles that came after. But something was lost at Ong Tan that could never be recovered. Not just the lives of 58 young men, but something more intangible. A certain kind of innocence or belief in the rightness of the cause. The soldiers who survived the battle came home changed in ways that were hard to explain. Clark Welch, who had been a true believer in the war, came out of it completely disillusioned. He told David Moranis years later that if he had been in Madison, Wisconsin on October 17, 1967, instead of in the Long Nguyen secret zone, he probably would have been protesting the war himself. That is a remarkable statement from a man who had nearly died fighting it, and it suggests just how profoundly the experience had shaken his faith in the military establishment and the government that had sent him there. The larger story of Vietnam is too complex to reduce to any single battle or any single lesson. The war was a catastrophe for everyone involved, for the Americans who fought and died and came home to a nation that did not want to hear about their sacrifice, for the Vietnamese who suffered losses on a scale that Americans can barely comprehend, for the countries of Southeast Asia that were destabilized by the conflict and its aftermath. Millions of people died, and for what? The Communists won anyway, and Vietnam today is a unified country that has diplomatic relations with the United States and welcomes American tourists and investment. The dominoes that were supposed to fall across Asia never really fell, or at least not the way the strategists predicted. The threat that seemed so urgent in 1967 looks very different from the perspective of half a century later. But none of that takes away from what the soldiers at Ong Tan experienced or what they sacrificed. They did not make the policy decisions that sent them to Vietnam. They did not choose the strategy of search and destroy, or the individual replacement system, or any of the other factors that contributed to the disaster of October 17, 1967. They were young men, most of them barely out of their teens, who were trying to do their duty as they understood it. They trusted their leaders and their government to use them wisely, and that trust was betrayed. They marched into sunlight because they were ordered to, because they believed it was the right thing to do, because they did not want to let down the men beside them. And they died, many of them, in a battle that accomplished nothing, that was forgotten almost as soon as it was over, that became just another statistic in a war full of terrible statistics. The men who survived the Battle of Ong Tan carried the memory of that day with them for the rest of their lives. They gathered at reunions, they stayed in touch with each other, they visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington to trace the names of their fallen comrades on the black granite wall. They wrote books and gave interviews, trying to ensure that the story would not be forgotten, that the sacrifice of the Black Lions would be remembered even if the war itself was consigned to the dustbin of history. General Terry Allen Sr., the father of the battalion commander who died at Ong Tan, was still alive when his son was killed. He received the news at his home in El Paso, Texas, and was devastated. His health, which had already been declining, worsened rapidly after Terry Jr.'s death. He died less than 2 years later, in September 1969, having lost his only child to a war that must have seemed very different from the one he had fought a quarter-century before. He was buried at Fort Bliss National Cemetery in El Paso, and his son was buried beside him, father and son reunited in death, both of them soldiers to the end. The legacy of the Battle of Ong Tan is complicated, like the legacy of Vietnam itself. It can be seen as a story of failure, of intelligence failures and tactical failures and leadership failures that got good men killed. It can be seen as a story of heroism, of soldiers who fought with desperate courage against overwhelming odds, who refused to give up even when everything was lost. It can be seen as a story of waste, of young lives thrown away in a war that was never going to be won by the methods being used to fight it. Or it can be seen simply as a tragedy, a moment when the cruelty and randomness of war were concentrated into a single terrible morning in a jungle that most Americans would never see and could barely imagine. I think about Mike Troyer sometimes, crouching behind his anthill in the shade, watching the sunlight kill his friends. I think about him mailing that letter to himself, trying to create some small welcome in a world that did not seem to care whether he lived or died. I think about him struggling for decades with the memories, finally writing his book, finally getting the recognition and the treatment he deserved. And I think about the fact that he died almost 52 years after the battle, still haunted by what he had seen, still trying to make sense of it, still connected to the men who had not been as lucky as he was. That is what war does to people. It marks them forever, even the ones who walk away without visible wounds. The men of the Black Lions who survived Ong Tan carried the weight of that day for the rest of their lives, and they did so with a quiet dignity that deserves our respect and our gratitude. They did not ask for sympathy or special treatment. They just wanted to be remembered, and they wanted their fallen comrades to be remembered, and they wanted the country they had served to understand something about what they had sacrificed. This has been another story from Great American Classics. Before we finish, it's worth taking a moment to remember the men of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, who died on October 17, 1967, in a place called Ong Tan. They were sons and brothers and husbands and fathers. They were young men with their whole lives ahead of them, cut down in a few terrible hours in a jungle far from home. They did not choose the war they were sent to fight, but they fought it anyway, because that is what soldiers do. Lieutenant Colonel Terry Allen Jr. died leading his men, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather and great-grandfather, a fourth-generation soldier who gave his life for his country. He was 38 years old. The 57 men who died with him were younger still, most of them in their early 20s, some of them teenagers. Their names are on the wall in Washington, and their story is part of our history now, whether we want to remember it or not. And before I go, I want to read one last thing that caught my attention, and this article. Troyer said he had no illusions that returning soldiers would be greeted as heroes. Other than his parents, he wasn't sure if anyone would be happy to see him. So what he did before he left Vietnam is he made sure to send himself a self-addressed letter to welcome himself back home to civilian life. And I think we ought to do a better job of making sure our veterans feel welcomed when they come back home to us. Nobody should have to lay their life down, and then they can't even receive a letter of love and support from the people in their surrounding communities. So, Mr. Troyer, I want to personally thank you for your service and allowing me to have the freedom that I do today. Everyone be safe and be blessed. Signing off again, until next time, this is Bill.